The Vinny D
One. Hey, I got the man himself, John McClain. John, I'm a transplant here in Houston, and the way I came about finding you then the first time was you're to a lot of the circles I'm around. You are the Texans guy. You are the football guy here in Houston. So it's very fun to have you on. So John, thanks for coming on.
Vinny, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I got to kind of do a little bit of research on your background, and one of the things that amazed me is you've been in the journalism world, especially the sports journalism world, for the better part of over 4 decades. So you've seen a tremendous amount of change just in the way sports are played, in the way culture views sports. So, if you don't mind, kind of starting all the way at the beginning. What interested you in getting into journalism, and then especially around like sports journalism? Like what brought you kind of to that circle?
Vinny, I grew up in Waco. I was a diehard Baylor fan, and I was a diehard Cowboys fan. And I liked the Oilers because in 1960, when the Cowboys were born and the AFL was born, Cowboys and the NFL were boring as heck. 3 yards and a cloud of dust. They were on CBS. The Oilers threw the ball all over the place, scored a lot of touchdowns. They won the first 2 championships when I was 8 years old. And so I was kind of captivated by the team that was more exciting to watch. And then I became a diehard Cowboys fan when I grew up, and I went to Baylor games, Baylor football, basketball, baseball, and I used to be able to sneak in. And then I got too big to sneak in. I had to work a bunch of odd jobs to afford tickets. I always sat in the end zone where it was 50 cents at football games. I was able to sneak into basketball games for a long time. I had a system down where we went in the back entrance right after players opened the door and got through. And so when I got out of high school, I had no clue what I wanted to do. And I knew I wanted to go to Baylor. But the smartest thing I ever did was go to McClain Junior College in Waco and take hard classes that would transfer to Baylor, like religion. And I was a terrible student. And so somebody told me an easy class was Introduction to Mass Communications. So I took it because I thought it was easy. And I sat next to a guy, and we talked first few days about sports, specifically football. And then he came up to me and he said, you seem to know more about football than most people. I said, I know more about football than anybody in Waco. And so he said, I'm a photographer for the Tribune Herald, Waco Tribune Herald, and we have an opening for Friday Night Football. Would you be interested? And I said, what is that? He said, where we bring in people to come from 8 to midnight on Friday nights, and you get by a phone, and then a correspondent from the game will call in and tell you who scored and the statistics, and then you run them into the sports department. The sports writers will write it. So I said, how much does it pay? This would have been in 1971. And he said, it pays $25. I said, I'm in. And so I started doing that, and I always had read newspapers. My dad always would hand me the Waco Tribune Herald. Dave Campbell, founder of Texas Football Magazine, 40-year sports editor of the Tribune Herald, just an icon in Texas journalism. Everybody in Waco worshiped Dave Campbell, who's 95 years old and working on another book right now. And he said, you want to know what's going on in sports, read Dave Campbell. So I did from the time I was old enough to read. And so I went to the Tribune Herald, and I noticed that after midnight, all these other correspondents left, and I started hanging out in the sports department because they didn't get off till 2 o'clock, and I kind of got the bug. And when they told me that you could get in Cowboy games free, Baylor games free, and the Astros free, I said to myself, I got to find out how to do this. I didn't know how to type. I didn't know how to do anything. So I started taking journalism classes, typing, shorthand, things that I could, and then I transferred to Baylor, and then they hired me full time in 1973 at the Tribune Herald while I was going to Baylor. And I was working 60 hours a week and trying to barely get through school. Already knew what I wanted to do, had a job. I was fascinated. I could go to Texas Stadium and watch the Cowboys. I could come to the Astrodome and watch the Astros, and I could go to any Baylor event. I didn't have to sneak in. And I covered high schools, and I worked there 3.5 years. Took me an extra year to get out of Baylor, and I had a blast covering all sports there. I loved covering Little League because I was one of the greatest moments of my life was 1964 when I was told I made the Northwestern All-Stars, and I thought life would never get better than that. Got my picture and name in the Tribune Herald. I thought it'll never get better than that. And so I was kind of smitten. And so it took me an extra year and a half to get out of Baylor because I was working so much at the Tribune Herald. But I thought, man, at the time, I always wanted to go to Houston or Dallas. Back then, a lot of us would work at the Tribune Herald for Dave Campbell while we were going to Baylor. And then when they graduated, they'd go to Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, or out of state, because back then there were 2 papers in Dallas, 2 in Houston, 2 in San Antonio, and being a sports writer for a newspaper was a really big deal. And so I did that. I had a great professor named David McClain in journalism. He helped me get on with the Chronicle and came down here in October of 1976, started first Oilers training camp was in 77, and I've been blessed to be doing it ever since.
Yeah, well, I got to be honest. It's awesome to read your columns because, and I will dive more into the career side of it. But it's fun because you're one of the journalists that I see, especially from a hometown journalist of a sport team that doesn't sugarcoat it, that doesn't have such a fansy kind of Kool-Aid drinking kind of approach to it. I mean, you call it like you see it, and I think that's why you've been probably in this era for so long around the sport.
Well, I try to be fair. You got to build credibility. The only way you can build credibility is by doing something, acting in a certain way. Bill O'Brien was, we were in an argument last year, and I stopped him and I said, "Have I been unfair to you?" He goes, "Well, no." And then he started chewing me out some more. And so that's all I want to be, is for people to say I'm fair. And like right now, the Texans are 0-2. Everybody's ready to fire Bill O'Brien. They're ready to get rid of the offensive coordinator, Tim Kelly. And one thing I've learned covering the NFL for 44 years, you can't base a season on 2 games. Texans proved that 2 years ago. They started 0-3 and finished 11-5. And it's not what you do in September and October, but November and December. So I don't mind being critical when I think it deserves it, but I also think you should try to find the facts. And you build up that credibility. And through the decades, I think I've done that because I've tried to be honest. They don't agree with everything I write or tweet or say, and I understand that. They shouldn't. If they did, I wouldn't be doing my job. But also don't mind taking the Texans' side when others don't, if I believe it. I've always felt, Vinny, if I write something or broadcast something or tweet it and it's what I believe and it turns out to be wrong, I got nobody to blame but myself. If I were to do that based on what other people thought and then later it turned out to be different, I'd go, man, why didn't I go with what I believe? Like when the Texans were 0-3 in 2018, if I didn't believe that O'Brien should be fired at 0-3. I thought he deserved to go the distance on the season, and I said that. But had I written and broadcast that I thought he should be fired, and then they finished 11-5, I'd have gone, man, why in the world didn't I go with what I believe? And I'm not always right. I know that. A lot of people disagree with me, and I understand that. Really, because the internet, Vinny, all we've got is our opinion. And for your people to pay attention to your opinion, they have to believe that they can rely on you, even if they disagree with you.
Sure, and I've brought this up before to people in journalism. I think there's a really big correlation to those that got into journalism before the Twitter boom of the world, right? Where it used to be who was correct, whereas now it's who's first. And now you're starting to see a mixture of both because people are starting to weed out those that are just first to create a hot topic and really still try to search for what the truth is. But I think someone like yourself and others that I've spoken to, when you grew up in journalism where you had to go search and find the facts and then report on them. And they weren't reported in the first 2 minutes, right? Just like you're talking about with Friday night games, you're getting phone calls in, those things are printed the next day, right? Like there was time to cultivate the story and get it right and then get it out there. How have you kind of taken that with, maybe even your early Oilers days to now with the Texans of kind of balancing the, let me get all my facts straight before I get a story out versus, well, I also can't sit on this for 3 days because 50 other people are going to run this story. I still have to get it out.
It used to be you write it or read it, and now you tweet it or read it. But I will not tweet something unless I know it. Now, a lot of people get around it. And the problem with the internet, most people on there don't have a journalism background.
Sure.
Most of them have done something else, and they like having an opinion. They like to blog. They like to stir up controversy, and there's no accountability for them at all. At the Chronicle, I still have bosses looking over my shoulder, and I know I need to be accurate. And one of the things that drives me crazy about my business today is the way agents of players leak things to national media. Now, I don't blame them. Adam Schefter's got 7 million followers, and I only have 141,000. And while I have, I think, the second most of any beat writer in the country to Mary Kay Cabot of Cleveland.com, that's a pimple on an elephant's butt compared to Adam Schefter and even Ian Rappaport and some of the other national people. So I don't like it. I understand it. Fortunately, the bosses understand it. But the way a lot of people get around things is they say, I could write, Bill O'Brien could be fired in regular season. Well, I say could be. I didn't say will be. And if he isn't, I say, hey, I didn't say would be. I said he could be. And nobody's going to dispute that. And so that would get a lot of attention. It would get a lot of clicks. But I can't do that. That's not the way I play the game. Fortunately, I've been able to play the game this way. I've had to adjust to the internet. I didn't want to be an old dog you couldn't teach new tricks when we had our website. And they told me at the Winter Olympics in 2002, when you finish writing for the Chronicle, write a story and send it to this guy. And I said, who's that? He said, he's the sports editor of the editor of our website. I said, what's a website? And they told me. So every night in Salt Lake, while everybody else was out partying, I was banging out hockey stories for our website. And so I understood early on, you better do videos, you better do commentary, you better do podcasts. When they came around, you damn sure better tweet. So I tried to do all those, and it takes up a whole lot more time, cost me my golf game, which is okay. But I miss the old days where you could go to a game, watch the game, take notes, go down to the dressing room, talk to players, talk to coaches, come back up, sit down, get a Coke or Diet Coke, think a little about it, and then write a story and notes and report card, do it that way. But today, everything's done so fast because it's 24/7. Some things got to be fresh, and they got to be opinionated. One thing I like about the Chronicle, they let me write my opinion, and so I like doing that. And so I've got a great job. I've been blessed to have it. That's for my 48th year in the business, 45 the Chronicle, 44 on the NFL, and I've been very blessed. It's a privilege to actually be paid to write and talk about sports.
Yeah, no, and it's fun to read it. It's fun to read your stuff. And so you now, of course, you've done this for a long, long time, but you also have the accolades to go along with this. You've won awards that have you hanging in the Football Hall of Fame. You are, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I did read this. You are on the Hall of Fame voting committee. Is that true?
I'm in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I'm on the Pro Football Hall of Fame selection committee, seniors committee, coaches committee. I'm in the Texas Sports Hall of Fame. I'm on the Texas Sports Hall of Fame selection committee.
See, so it does correlate, right? Other people agree with me that it is fun reading your stuff. But one of the things I thought was so cool when I was reading about your background was being on the selection committee for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. How has that kind of been for you to be a part of that, because you got to see it from kind of the early on startup of covering a single team and kind of having that emotional drive toward a single team, and then being able to look at it objectively and say, this guy that played for X team that I didn't cover, but I got to watch his career, and then look at that in totality and be able to vote on someone like that's going to make it into the Hall of Fame. So how does that kind of fit? How exciting I think that has to be a very fun thing to be a part of.
Fun. It's a privilege, and it's an enormous responsibility because the committee changes people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And every year, so many people are devastated because they don't get it.
Sure.
And it's not because we say they don't deserve it. It's for whatever reason we say others are more deserving that year.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen guys wait 20 years. I've seen guys wait 35 years. And the longer they wait, the more they appreciative are of that honor. I'm on my 28th year of being on that selection committee. And I've presented former Oilers like Elvin Bethea, Mike Munchak, Curly Culp, Bruce Matthews, Warren Moon, and Robert Brazil. And those guys have all made it. And it's been a privilege to present them and knowing what a big honor it is for them. I just did a 45-minute Zoom with Robert Brazil today for the Texans Facebook Live page, and we were talking about the process and how long he waited. He was a senior nominee. I'm on the seniors committee, and it was so emotionally rewarding to see Robert get what he has deserved for so long. And there have been guys that don't make it. It's heartbreaking to see it. You try to encourage them and tell them, keep that stiff upper lip and don't ever lose patience. And the process, people don't understand our process. One time I was watching a guy on the NFL Network trash our committee after we had a vote. So I called the network and said, I'd like to come on there and debate Jamie Dukes. And they said, okay, we'll do it live. I said, great. So they came on, they introduced us, and first thing I said, well, Jamie, I heard you bashing our committee for the decisions we made. Let the viewers know what the process is. And he's like, because nobody knows the process. We had James Lofton and Dan Fouts, who are in the Hall of Fame. They monitored our committee for 2 years, and then they put them on it, and they were blown away by what we go through. Now we've added Bill Polian, great general manager in the Hall of Fame, Tony Dungy, Hall of Fame coach. They're going to be on our committee. They're going to see how hard it is. I had one of the biggest privileges I've ever had was be on the Centennial Committee. And that was with guys like Bill Belichick and Gil Brandt, John Madden, and Ron Wolf, and Bill Polian, and Dick LeBeau, people that have been through the NFL a lot longer than I have. And watching them go through the process where we selected a Centennial class for the 100-year anniversary, that was so interesting and informing, interesting, inspiring. And I was so honored to be part of that. So the way it is, anybody nominate anybody for the Hall of Fame. We just, like, the list came out last week, there's 130 on it. And then we will whittle that list down to 25. And then from 25, we will whittle it down to 15 modern era finalists, of which 5 can be voted in, and then 1 senior, 1 coach, and 1 contributor. And that is, we vote on those guys after we spend about 8 hours a day before the Super Bowl working on it. And every year it's a great class, and I just feel bad we couldn't put everybody in there. But when I see people turn to mush, some of the most hard-ass coaches when they played players, that they were spitfire, and when they make the Hall of Fame, they just cry like babies. And being able to watch that and experience that with them is it just blows my mind.
Yeah, and there is one question, if you can give me kind of an insight to, which I've always questioned. How much of the off the field personas or publicized things comes into play, or if at all, when these discussions come up, especially toward maybe those that getting it from 25 to 15 or 15 down to 5. I understand maybe at 125, you can kind of tell who was a great player and maybe not, but maybe not. I mean, I look at, 10 players on each team that I think are very, very good. So I couldn't imagine whittling it down. But how much does the off the field or extracurricular stuff come into play?
0. The
Okay.
bylaws say it doesn't matter what they do outside the white lines. It's what they do inside the white lines. We don't judge on morality. We judge on performance. Now, I've always said some player could sniff the white line and be okay because we can't take that into consideration. But if a player was disruptive to his team off the field, if he caused the team to, we think, or we've been told by people that he caused the team to lose and stuff like that, that does count. But what they do about getting arrested, getting busted, things like that, We don't do it. I'd hate to see OJ come up and today, because based on our bylaws, we'd have to change him because he murdered 2 people. I don't care what the jury said, and we'd have to put him in based on the way the bylaws are today. So I hope to God, if that were that case and it ever happens, they would change the bylaws to keep us from being embarrassed like that. Players like Pete Rose would be in the Hall of Fame if he was pro football. We call it, we don't legislate morals.
Okay. Yeah, it's always been a concern, or I guess a question to me, because the player, of course, that comes to mind is of recent nature in Terrell Owens, right? I know he's got to be a guy that's kind of brought up on those lists year in, year out. And, to me as a layperson, right, I always think it's the off the field stuff that maybe keeps him out, but I'm sure there's 50 other receivers that are kind of in the mix every year.
T.O. made it on the 3rd year. To me, if you're going to be a first ballot nominee, there can be no doubt.
Sure.
And the thing about T.O., he never did anything wrong. He never did anything off the field. He never got arrested. He didn't do anything wrong. Now, he had a lot of things on the sidelines, on the bench, and that's part of the game. He did a lot of things like that. But to me, he wasn't Randy Moss. Randy Moss, Jerry Rice, those were the few no-brainers. Michael Irvin's got 3 Super Bowl rings. He waited 3 years. He didn't whine and cry about it. Chris Carter didn't get in on first ballot. There have been a lot of great players that didn't get in on first ballot, and they got in later, and they never made it a big issue. Only T.O. did.
Yeah, and the other thing, I think, at least from my perspective, football writers or football voters on the Hall of Fame do have a better rap than the way I perceive baseball writers. And what I do appreciate about the football voters are, it doesn't seem like there's this aura around not giving 100% or the idea of a first ballot Hall of Famer. I think the football committee does a better job of getting the best players in, and I know that's got to be a tough decision. When you look at it, though, from a stats perspective, does some things
come in? Let me go back to what you just said.
Sure.
Randy Moss took an entire season off, quit, and we didn't hold it against him. And there are players that take plays off. But if they're great players and you watch them play and you say that's a Hall of Famer, we're not going to hold that against him. There's a lot of players that take plays off. Not many take seasons off. But a lot of players. I had one player for the Oilers one time tell me, if the play is away from me and I can't get to it, I'm not going to go all out chasing it, because I'm going to need to go all out on the next play and the play after that. And I always respected that. So when it comes to effort, if the effort has kept you from realizing your potential, then you're not going to be a Hall of Famer. And so that's something I've never had anybody bring up at one of our meetings. And one of the things I like about our committee, there's 48 of us, and when we're on the phone and email and texting and DMing all year about what we think, and I never waste a chance when I'm around a Hall of Famer to not say, hey, who's not in you think should be in and why? And sometimes they'll tell me, and I'll say, do you mind if I use that? And they'll say, of course not. So I'll bring it up to our committee. And then when we vote the day before the Super Bowl, we're there 8-9 hours, and we're constantly talking, and we can see what each other thinks. Baseball votes anonymously. They just send it in, and that's it. So I like our process a whole lot better, because we got a pretty good idea of who thinks what.
Sure. No, absolutely. Now, I do have a question, though. So, football's changed on its head from 40 years ago versus now, right? The way the game's played, the scores, the offensive projections, those kind of things. When you're looking at a player, how much do you consider the era that they played in versus the totality of their stats? Because a quarterback that played maybe in the mid 70s to mid 80s, right, probably didn't throw the ball 50 times a game like the average, like you're going to get now. So how much does that come into play when you're trying to look at it and compare a quarterback of that era versus, I think we all know Brady, Breeze, guys like that should walk right in on the first ballot. But maybe your middle of the road kind of quarterback now will probably have better stats than someone that may have played 30 or 40 years ago, but their contribution to the league and their team may warrant them getting into the Hall. So how do you guys look at something like that?
We don't compare generations because it's unfair. And one of the reasons you just mentioned is rule changes. But if a guy caught 60 passes for 800 yards, and the rules were he could be hit in the head when he came across the middle by a defensive back who had a padded arm to make it a lethal weapon. If people could go through his knees, if they could hit him from behind and knock him out. If you catch 60 passes for 800 yards that way, compared to 100 passes for 1,400 yards today when they can barely breathe on you, that's a huge difference. But we don't say that guy from the 60s or the 70s, we don't compare him to the ones today because it wouldn't be fair to him. The game was different. Like today, training camp lasts about a month. They don't have double days. They don't hit. They don't take people to the ground. When I started covering the NFL, they'd have 2 3-hour practices, and training camp was 6 games, 6 exhibition games, and then they played at 8 weeks of camp, 2 months, and they hit from the first day on. And I don't think they had any more injuries then than they do today, but it's just different. I tell players that sometimes, and they think I'm making it up. And I said, well, you could look it up. You guys played back then, you'd be calling your mommies after the first practice. But it was different. You don't compare them. It's not fair. That was great. This is great too.
Yeah, and to speak on the injury thing too, one thing I've noticed, and I'm sure a ton of people have noticed it, a ton of the injuries nowadays are really around the muscles and ligaments, and I think it's a formulation of surface areas that they're playing on, but also the different strength programs and programs that there are. Bodies are so much tighter now; they're not used to getting hit, and their bodies are so wired, and athletes are in such phenomenal shape. But they're dealing with ligaments that are this long and this thin, and that's where a lot of the injuries are now. So I think they can hit as much as they want in camp. They're going to tear an ACL. They're going to tear an ACL, and I think that is what it is.
When I started with the Oilers, and they had in an old facility maybe 1 bench press and a few dumbbells, and that was it. But they didn't lift a lot of weights, but they ran and they ran and they ran. And a lot of players had off-season jobs, and they would start getting in shape in June. Earl Campbell and a lot of players would run up and down the bayous, and they would run until they knocked all the grass was off of it, up and down in the heat and humidity of June. Then when they would get to training camp at various places around Texas, they'd be ready to go. My first training camp, 1977, on the Stephen F. Austin campus in Nacogdoches, 36 Oilers spent at least 1 night in the hospital getting IVs. Well, today they're in better shape, and also they can get IVs right there at the facility or training camp. So it was different then, but they wanted to practice and play the guys into shape. And that's the thing. Like baseball pitchers today, when Nolan Ryan pitched, he was running and riding a stationary bike constantly because he always said so much of his velocity came from his butt and his legs, and he worked on them all the time. I bet he never lifted a weight. Of course, today everybody wants to be on weights. They spend a fortune on trying to keep these guys healthy, but nothing seems to matter. If they're going to have injuries, they're going to have injuries. And hamstrings, groins, calf muscles, those are among the worst.
Right. No, absolutely. So I do want to kind of transition into talking about today's football, right? And particularly this season. The Texans, yeah, I would love to start there because that kind of is what you cover on a day-to-day basis. But 0-2 start is tough. But the 2 teams they played are 2 of the perennial teams, or should be the perennial teams of the AFC right now. So yeah, they may have not looked the greatest against them, but I don't think anyone's shocked that they're 0-2 against those teams. Seeing that and the way they've played, I mean, what's your overall outlook on the season? Are you still thinking they'll be able to kind of squeak together a better than 8-8 season and be in the hunt later on, or you think this is going to be an uphill climb for the majority of the year?
One thing I've learned in 44 years, Vinny, is you can't tell squat after 2 games. I'll give you some example. Last year, Titans 2-4. Everybody said Mike Vrabel's in over his head. Offensive coordinator Arthur Smith, in his first year as the coordinator, was in over his head. They finished 9-7, go the AFC championship game. 2 years ago, in Frank Reich's first season, Colts start 1-6 with Andrew Luck. Everybody says Luck can't play anymore. Reich's in over his head. They make the playoffs, beat the Texans. 2 years ago, Ravens 4-5. John Harbaugh's got to be fired. Shelf life is over. They put in Lamar Jackson, and they've only lost 2 regular season games since. So you just can't tell early in the season, and a lot of people think they can. And to me, I mean, they believe they can, and every once in a while you're right. Atlanta had a terrible start last year, finished fast. It takes time. Now, I picked the Texans to start 0-3 in August. I picked them to be 1-3, and then I picked them to finish 10-6 because the schedule, once they play Green Bay, eases up considerably. They have 2 teams that made the playoffs last year, New England and Tennessee, and they play them both at home, and they beat them both last year. But the thing about the Texans' first 2 games as compared to, say, the 0-3 start 2 years ago, 2 years ago they lost 3 one-score games. And this one they've been beaten by 14 and 16 by, I think, 2 best teams in the league along with Green Bay. And there's the thing that bothers me the most, if I'm a Texans fan, would be how the offense does not look sharp. I understand they got new receivers and they've got a new running back, but they got the same offensive line back. To me, they just ought to be more cohesive, and that includes Deshaun Watson. The defense I knew was going to be bad. I didn't have as high of expectations, but I'll say this about the defense. Last year, they played Kansas City and Baltimore, and they allowed Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes to throw 7 touchdown passes. This year, they threw 4 short ones, all within the 10-yard line. So they haven't given up big plays on defense. Their pass rush was better against Baltimore. But not having preseason games is important for players, but also when you have new play callers. Offensive coordinator Tim Kelly, defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver, they're calling the plays for the first time. They could have used those 4 preseason games. But I think the Texans would be better. If they were to upset Pittsburgh, and let's be honest about the Steelers, they beat the Giants and the Broncos. Like the Texans, they haven't won a game. People are fired up about Buffalo. They beat the Jets in Miami. People are fired up about the Bears. They've beaten 2 winless teams. Let's wait till these teams start playing somebody. I was asked on 610 about why Jacksonville's better than the Texans. I said, well, now, if Jacksonville had played Kansas City and Baltimore, do you think they'd be 1-1? If the Texans had played Indianapolis at home and at Tennessee where they won last year, would they be 0-2? I don't think so. So these things got to play out, and I still think they'll compete with Tennessee for the AFC South title, which they've won 4 of the last 5 years.
Sure. Yeah. And there's another thing I want to talk about on a lot of these teams. Yeah, there's been some flack going around about the size or the extension of Deshaun Watson, and not necessarily that they paid him, but maybe, did they need to pay him right now? Could they let it wait out the year? Then you get the 5th-year option, then you get some franchise years, and that I'm not really a hater on the deal. I think they should have done it. I think you lock it up. But really what my point is all of the changes, whether it's to wide receivers, to running backs, to multiple systems, to everything, the team's going to be run by the quarterback. And if you look at most of the successful teams in the NFL right now, their quarterbacks were homegrown. Most of the quarterbacks that are leading teams, except for maybe the Saints, really, and I'm not really going to count the Brady and the Buccaneers yet because I don't think they're a real contender. But Breeze is really the only one that kind of came over and has had another kind of light of a career. But the majority of the quarterbacks are homegrown. I think there's a real push to keep that. Do you think with the contract extension of Deshaun Watson that they've at all leveraged too much in order for the talent that maybe the team still needs?
Absolutely not, because he's still on his original contract for 2 years. Mm-hmm. That contract, like Patrick Mahomes, is not going to hurt him until the 3rd year. So they got plenty that they can do if they're smart with their salary cap. And I think it's a cop-out to say when a quarterback takes up a big chunk of the salary cap that you can't make moves. Good teams make good moves. And Packers stay on top every year, and Rodgers had the greatest contract in NFL history. So that's not true. And anybody says they should have waited on Watson, the longer you wait, the more it's going to cost. Why would you do that? Watson won't get to the end of this contract any more than Patrick Mahomes will. In 4 years, both of them will have them redone. Sure. And at some point in their careers, they're going to look back and go, man, I can't believe I signed for only $45 or $39 million a year. What was my agent thinking? Because the contracts are just going to keep going up, up, and up. I think the smartest thing they did, they said they wanted to get Watson by the start of the season, and they did. They got Laramie Tunsil, Whitney Merciless, and Zach Cunningham. Those were the ones they wanted to get done. They wanted to keep nose tackle DJ Reader. They offered him $10 million a year. He got 13 from Cincinnati. Nobody begrudged him that. They weren't going to give him 13 when he played 60% of the plays and wasn't a pass rusher. And people say, well, they miss Reader against the run. No, because last year he was starting nose tackle, and over the last 7 games, they gave up 164 yards rushing, and then counting the playoffs, that's 9 games, and in those 9 games, they gave up 166 rushing, and so now it's 170. So it was much more than DJ Reader. So I think the more you get done, the faster you get it, the less it's going to cost you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you had to get the deal. I think the deal was smart. Needed to get it done. He's clearly a franchise quarterback, so I don't think there's anything I'm going to hold against the Texans on that. The one question mark I did have this offseason, which I think a lot of players or people did, was the trade of DeAndre Hopkins. I think that caught a lot of people by surprise, especially giving up a generational talent like that, with not a lot of resources, especially in the draft, both this past year and next year. Because those were kind of leveraged to get guys like Tunsil, like you mentioned. So where you, as someone that's a little more connected, of course, to the team and to the front office, was this as much of a surprise to you as it was to someone like me? And where do you sit kind of on that deal and what they've done to construct the wide receiver core around that?
Well, first of all, I wasn't surprised because Hop had been trying to get his contract redone for over a year. And I used to talk to him about it off the record. He was going to make $12 million this year. He wanted a $10 million raise. They weren't going to give him a $10 million raise with 3 years left. The only player they've done in their history with 3 years left was Andre Johnson because he had bad representation and signed a bad contract. And so Bob McNair, the owner, told Rick Smith, the general manager, redo his contract and make it more fair, and they did. When they redid White with 2 years left after he'd won his second NFL Defensive Player of the Year award, Dwayne Brown came to him. I want mine redone with 2 years left. Rick Smith said, no, our policy's with 1 year left. Well, you redid White. And they basically told him, well, you're not White. So he held out, forced to trade, and created a lot of controversy. So when you do things like that, if you redo Hopkins with 3 years left, agents are going to call and say, you did it for him, do it for my guy. And you say, well, you're not Hop. So if Hopkins had not demanded to have his contract redone, he'd still be here. They had to re-sign these other guys and Watson. That was their primary goal, and they just weren't going to redo it with 3 years left. Had he played this year, I think they would have redone it with 2, like they did with Watson.
Yeah, I mean, it was surprising to see as far as a talent, but it makes more sense on the contract side, and you sometimes you have to do it. Now, me, I'm a Jet fan, right? So I've constantly seen players leave anytime they talk about contracts because that team is just an atrocity walking. As you look at the rest of the NFL, and again, I know it's 2 weeks into the season, so we don't have a lot of material to look at. But are there any 1 or 2 teams that are kind of maybe catching your eye, or maybe you thought they had more to come? I mean, the team that jumps out to me is the Raiders. I don't think the Saints looked great last night, but I do think the Raiders may be better than some people think. Are there any teams that you're looking at to say, keep an eye on this team, this is a playoff team, or at least someone that's going to be competitive style like that?
Of the 0-2 teams, I was asked on Sports Radio 610 about which 0-2 teams that I think had the best chance to bounce back, and I said Houston, Minnesota, and Philadelphia.
Okay.
All of them were in the playoffs last year. All of them were favored to get back to the playoffs. I think they have too much talent not to rebound. And they've got the Doug Peterson's won a Super Bowl. Mike Zimmer's not won one as a head coach. And, of course, Bill O'Brien gets in the playoffs, but he can't get beyond the second round of the playoffs. But I think those 3. The biggest surprise to me has been Jacksonville. Doug Marrone, the coach, got control of personnel like Bill O'Brien and so many other coaches. O'Brien's only coach with a GM title, but there's a lot of other coaches that have the same responsibility without the title, and Doug Marrone being one. So he weeded out guys that he didn't think fit his culture, and right now they're 1-1. They hadn't had a field goal, they hadn't had a pass blocked at the line of scrimmage, and it was intercepted. At the end, they might have come back and beat the Titans instead of losing 33-30 in Nashville. So Jacksonville, to me, has been the biggest surprise because so little was expected of them. I didn't pick the Raiders to make the playoffs. They struggled to win at Carolina, one of the worst teams in the league. Thing that I picked New Orleans and Baltimore in the Super Bowl with the Saints to win. After watching Drew Brees in 2 games has thrown 68 passes, only 10 have, only 7 have been for 10 or more yards. He's completed 2. And watching him not be able to throw the ball down the field at his age, that was sad. And I'm hoping he can bounce back. But they struggled to beat the Buccaneers, so I don't think they're the best team like I predicted they would be right now. Best team in the NFL, in the NFC is Green Bay, which has scored 45 points. There was all that belly aching by the media that the mean old Packers wouldn't give Aaron Rodgers a receiver. What were they going to do? And think how many points they'd scored if he actually had another receiver. They've only scored 85. So I think Green Bay, I picked them to win the division. And right now, they're the best team in the NFC. And AFC is a 2-team race between Kansas City and Baltimore.
Yeah, I mean, there's one other team that I think is very good. Now, I'm curious to hear your opinion on it. Is Seattle? I think Russell is just amazing, and I think their team is starting to come together. I do think they've added some young talent in DK Metcalf, and Tyler Lockett is still a good receiver. I do kind of worry if they can hold up. I don't think they have a lot of depth. But what do you think about them to kind of give maybe Green Bay a run for their money late in the season?
As long as Wilson is healthy, they're never out of a game. He has 9 touchdown passes in 2 games. He's never been the MVP. I didn't pick San Francisco to go to the playoffs because the Super Bowl loser seldom does. Arizona's another surprise team, but they beat the 49ers, and then they got to play the Lions, and now they've got another weak sister coming up. But Seattle, as great as he played against the Patriots, it still took them stopping Cam Newton on the last play at the 1-yard line to avoid losing that game. And but I still like them right behind Green Bay. I think the top 4 teams right now are the ones I mentioned would be Green Bay, Seattle, Baltimore, and Kansas City.
And one other thing I wanted to touch on that you just kind of pointed out in the New England game, that they were down to the wire right there. I think for so many years, especially me being a Jet fan, right? I couldn't wait for Brady to get out of New England. I couldn't wait for that match, that marriage to end. But I think it just is more of a testament to how good of a coach Bill Belichick is and his coaching staff around him. And they play to their players and they coach to their players' benefit, right? I mean, Tom Brady's probably run the ball maybe 8 times in his career, and they're probably all on sneaks. Whereas now they have Cam Newton, and they've completely changed that offense. I think Josh McDaniels is doing a great job there. I think the whole team is doing a great job there. One of the detriments, I think, or one of the maybe the not detriment is the right word, but one of criticisms that Bill O'Brien gets is his offense lacks a little of the creativity toward his players' strength. I don't always think it's just the coach's fault when plays don't work, right? I think every play is drawn up to score a touchdown, and sometimes your players have to play it. But watching a coach like Belichick constantly change with whoever's on the field, and watching a coach like O'Brien, where the majority of the offenses stay the same. There have been wrinkles since Watson versus Schaub. You'd have to be completely blind not to see that. But do you think that there's something like that that's maybe missing from the Houston locker room, a little more creativity, a little more movement for Watson, or do you just think it's just non-execution right now?
I don't know what people mean by that on creativity. Last year he called a pass from DeAndre Hopkins to Deshaun Watson to help him beat New England when Watson had 3 touchdown passes against the number 1 defense in the league. He's gone for it on 4th down. It's backfired. He's tried a fake punt. He's done reverses. And so there's a lot of things that he's done. This year it's Tim Kelly calling the plays, but I'm not exactly sure what people think. To me, I don't like seeing runs on 1st and 2nd down. They ran the ball less last year than any time in O'Brien's first 6 years, and they've still finished 9th in rushing after 8th the year before because the emphasis went to Watson as it should. As far as having him run more, he runs enough now. Most of his runs are out of when he's having to scramble. But if you're scrambling 5 times and you have one run for 6, why would you want to give him 5 more? Lamar Jackson had 14 runs against the Texans. They kept him harnessed for the most part and kept him out of the end zone. A couple of times he took shots, but that's the way their offense is. I would not expose Watson anymore. It's going to take them some time to break in new receivers. They got talent at tight end. They got a lot of talented receivers. The key is for Watson to have time to decide which one to throw to. He has a lot of options. He has a lot of audibles he can call. But and like Hopkins, play to the talent. He was one of the most targeted receivers in the NFL with among the most catches every year. That's playing to the talent. And when Will Fuller was playing and not hurt, they threw the ball to him. People talk about how much Hopkins meant to the offense, and he did. But when Hopkins was in there and Fuller wasn't, they averaged almost 6 less points. When Fuller was in, they averaged almost 6 more.
Mm. Yeah, sure, for sure. Fuller can take a top off of defense quick, and I do love watching that. I guess if I could wrap up kind of this whole thing, your career in football and your coverage of football and everything like that, just your personal opinion as a fan of the sport, are you more of a fan of the way the NFL is played now, or were you more of a fan of the way the NFL was played maybe 30 or so years ago?
No, I like the way it is now. You have great athletes. They're so fast. Speed is, everybody has a need for speed. The quarterbacks are fabulous. You have all these great black quarterbacks. They didn't used to have Warren Moon. I covered every one of his practices, every one of his games. He's only African-American in the Hall of Fame. And while I loved the 80s with John Elway and Dan Marino and Warren Moon and quarterbacks like that, give me the current era in which we're seeing fabulous quarterbacks with so many different teams. And I won't be covering the NFL 20 years from now, but it'll be even different. Players will be bigger and faster then. They may have to make the field longer and wider, but I would not trade the football that I get to see today compared to the football that I grew up on and started covering.
Well, I'm with you there, John. I think it keeps it interesting, it keeps it fun, and it's been a great ride. Well, John, I know it's late. I know I kept you up, so I really do appreciate you coming on. But whether it's catching you on Twitter, catching you on thechronicle.com, reading your articles there, catching you on 610, catching you on Texans Live, I don't know how you keep it all up. I don't know how you sleep, but it's been fun as a fan to listen to you, to get to watch you, and again, I really appreciate you coming on.
Vinny, you're not keeping me up. I usually stay up to about 1 every night. That's why I like to do these late. I've got another one tomorrow night at 10 o'clock. I appreciate you having me. It was really fun. It was fun talking about the NFL, talking about sports. First time I did it on KTRH in 1976, I walked out of there and felt like I should have been frisked to get paid to talk about sports. And that's one of the many reasons I'm honored to do what I do. And I got a plan to continue doing it another 2 or 3 years, and then I'll become a fan. Thank you very much, Vinny, and stay safe.
Absolutely. You too, John.